Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. For those who don't know me, my name is Darlene McLennan and I'm the Manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, ADCET for short. Today's webinar will be live captioned. You can access those captions by clicking on the caption button at the top or bottom of your browser, but we also have a OneCaps web browser that you can see the captions in there. So we'll put the link into the chat now. Okay, before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Lutruwita, Tasmanian Aboriginal land, and in spirit of reconciliation, ADCET respectfully acknowledges the Lutruwita nations and also recognises the Aboriginal history and culture of the land. And I wish to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people who did not make elder status. Also acknowledge all the countries participating in this meeting, and also acknowledge any elders, ancestors and their elders and ancestors and the legacy to us and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples joining our meeting today. Also invite you to put in the chat where the lands you are on today. Okay, ADCET, you may have noticed if you're engaged in our work that we're currently undertaking a range of activities that aim to engage and support the tertiary sector in universal design for learning. In September, we'll be hosting a symposium, which is on Tuesday the 5th and Thursday the 7th. A link will be put into the chat now. Currently, presentations or a call for presentations is open till the 31st of this month. So if you want to tell your story or do a workshop or present, please put your name forward. Hopefully registrations will be open next Tuesday or Wednesday, and hopefully the full program will be out in the next week or so. As well as doing the symposium, we're also developing new content around universal design for learning. We've recently undertaken a podcast with Dara Ryder, who is from Ahead Island, which is a peak body similar to ours in Ahead. I really encourage you all to listen to that podcast. Dara is really reflective of the impact of UDL, and I think in his final few statements he talks about that the tertiary sector is a bit like a frog being boiled alive. We're all getting so busy in our work that probably time to reflect a little bit and look at some of the practices we undertake and how we can improve them to probably, bring about some workplace changes to ourselves as well as, for better experiences for students. So I think the link should have gone into the chat for that as well. And then finally, we're doing some webinars, undertaking some webinars. And this is the first one in the series. Today's webinar, Implementing Universal Design for Learning at University of University of Sydney, I'm so used to saying Tasmania. Lessons learned and scaling strategies. It's presented by Sarah Humphreys, an Educational Design Manager and UDL lead at the University of Sydney. I'm really excited that we've got Sarah with us today. Sarah's one of those people that I remembered where I was when I met her. I was fortunate to meeting her in one of the masterclasses we ran last year in Melbourne with Frederick. And yeah, just her enthusiasm and passion for UDL came through in meeting her. So I'm really excited about hearing about this presentation and what Sydney has undertaken. Looking forward to it. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping details. As I said at the beginning, this webinar is being live captioned, and thank you, Sharon from Bradley Reporting, and it is being recorded, and the recording will be on ADCET in the coming days. If you are having any technical difficulties or do throughout the webinar, you can contact us at admin@adcet.edu.au. Sarah will talk to us for around 45-50 minutes, and then we'll have 10 or so minutes for questions. We encourage people throughout the webinar to chat with each other in the chat. Some people can do two things at once. I'm losing my capacity slowly to do that. So I encourage you to have that chat. But if you want to ask Sarah a question, please add that to the Q&A box, and that's where I'll be managing the questions. I think we have the upvoting enabled, so you can tick the upvote, so the most popular question we can see in that. All right, that's it for housekeeping, enough of my voice. So I'll hand over to you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darlene, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm joining you from today, which is the Gadigal people. I'm on the northern beaches of Sydney, and I would also like to pay my respects to any First Nations people joining us today. So the presentation I'm going to give to you today is really a story about how we've been implementing universal design for learning at the University of Sydney. And I chose to pull it together as a story because I kind of wanted to share with you that it really is a journey. It's a journey that is iterative. It's kind of experimental, it's highly collaborative. And I thought if I told it as a story, that is also a way for all of you to connect, I hope, in some way with our journey so far. Some of you joining today, this might be the very start of your UDL journey. And there may be others who are already well on their way with their UDL journey. And hopefully you'll be able to identify and connect with different points along the story I'm going to share today. So the image on the screen here is just to give you a quick overview of our timeline and how I'm going to structure my presentation. So on the left here, I've chosen a graphic with just two faces or the outline of two images in there. This is really to tell you about the start of our journey, which happened back in September 2021, where funding was made available through the Disability Inclusion Action Plan to create a position for an educational designer with experience in UDL. So that was me. And that was how I came to work at the university. And the pilot project was from September 2021 through to June 2022. And again, what I'm hoping to show by this image is the importance of key documentation in supporting your implementation process. So as we move to the next bubble in the timeline, you can see that we've increased the numbers, and this really represents what happened after the initial pilot project. So my role, I was positioned within a central team at the university, the Educational Innovation Team. So although I was initially funded by the Disability Inclusion Action Plan, a conscious decision was made to base me as part of a central team. And the role of that central team is ultimately to support teaching at the university. So we were able to consider all students, not just students with disability. And then probably for the next 6 months or so, it was about taking our the learnings from the UDL pilot into our business, our day-to-day business training of academics and other professional staff. And I'll talk about that more in detail as we go on. And then the third bubble really represents where we are now. So in the circle here, you'll see we've got icons of a person and then lines reaching out and making connections. And this is where we're at the moment. So we're now running a project called the Designing for Diversity project. We launched that in May of this year. And this project is our response to our strategic plan and supporting and increasing diversity at the university. And through this project, we're now able, my role has now changed to Educational Design Manager, UDL lead. I have 2 educational designers working specifically with me on UDL, but we are part of the whole educational innovation team, which is very much a part of this project. And we also have some funding through the Disability Inclusion Action Plan still to work with one of the cast members, Dr. Elizabeth Berquist. And she's going to be working with us for the remainder of this year in the development of some resources that will have ongoing impact for the university. And I didn't mention my UDL champions as well. So all of these points will come out as part of our story. But the idea here was just to show you, in order for us to get going, the Disability Inclusion Action Plan and the strategic plan have been key pieces of documentation. So we'll go back to 2021, and this is the front cover on the left here of the university's DAP 2019 to 2024. And the reason why this was significant for getting us started is of the 6 objectives, objective 2 was for the university to be a higher education provider of choice for all students by providing innovative, creative, flexible and open learning environment that maximizes access, participation and success for all learners. And the clincher is here, the outcome 2.5 states how we can achieve that. And that will be by demonstrating application of the principles of universal design for learning. So UDL is actually stated as part of the plan. And that was what we used to base our pilot project on. So the pilot project, as you remember that graphic at the beginning, there were just icons of 2 heads, because essentially that was me and one academic who was interested to be a part of this project. So the 2 of us worked together, and it was a lovely position to be in, because we were able to meet regularly on a fortnightly basis and really build a rapport and brainstorm together, really. So the remit of the project was to redesign a unit of study, which was a first-year writing unit, to provide an exemplar of a universally designed unit that can support the inclusion of all learners. And I'm just going to draw your attention to the diagram here on the right-hand side of the screen. UDL implementation is, as I said, iterative, and it happens in phases. And CAST have developed this, this graphic to represent the 5 phases of implementation. We have explore, prepare, integrate, scale, and optimize. And so throughout my story, I just want to flag to you where I think we were in our journey, and how you'll see that we move through these circles, but we keep coming back to the beginning again. We keep coming back to explore. And I think that's something that can be helpful to take away from today. It's not linear. You know, you'll make gains, and then as you reflect on the next steps, it's almost like going back to the starting board. So these are some of the things that we did, and I've aligned it to the phases of UDL implementation. So we reviewed current data, which I've identified as being the explore phase. This unit of study was chosen as a pilot because it was a large first-year unit where there were increasing decline in student engagement. And when Benjamin Miller, who I worked with, and I started working together, we looked at the data that was available to us in relation to the students who were enrolled in the unit and their levels of engagement in terms of how they were interacting with the online materials. Okay, so that's part of the prepare phase, and I'll go into all of these in more detail in a moment. As part of the process of reviewing that data was available, reviewing the data that was available and how teaching materials were being delivered, we started to have these regular conversations and documented our journey along the way about what we were wanting to do and the changes we were wanting to make. So now we're looking at the integrate phase, where we're starting to put some of those changes into practice. And along the way, gathering data. This is a really important part of your implementation process, is to be very intentional about the changes you're hoping to effect and how you're going to gather evidence of that. And so we evaluated those, and as a result of that, I built a Canvas resource that was then available to all members of the university as a resource. So the next slides will give you some examples of what this actually looked like. What was really important was starting a conversation. And you'll notice that throughout our story, I use a lot of questions, and this is very much the way we worked. It's not so much you going in as a UDL expert and telling people what needs to change. It's about a problem-solving approach together. So working alongside each other, starting off with, tell me about your learners. So who is it who's in your unit? Who is it that you're designing for? And so in this particular writing unit, approximately 900 first-year students spread across the 2 semesters. 70% of that cohort were international students. 32 different languages were spoken at home. Around 1% of students were First Nations, 9% students with a disability, 7% of the cohort first in family to attend university. And as I mentioned before, we had data indicating that there was falling student engagement. So after we got this picture of what is the diversity that makes up the cohort, the next question was around, what do your learners find challenging? And this was to get a sense of, there are some things that we can anticipate, that we know that in the unit there always seems to be a stumbling block at a certain moment in time or over a particular task. And the 2 things that Ben identified were the students were not engaging with the required readings. And I'm just going to flick to my notes here so I can give you some more details on that. Less than 50% of students were engaging with the required readings at the start of the course, and this declined as the weeks went by, down to, by the final 2 weeks of semester, less than 10% of students were actually engaging with the required readings. So this was a concern. The other thing that learners found challenging were the individual practice activities. So again, there was data to show that just over half of the students were engaging with the practice activities at the start of the semester, but again, this was declining as the semester went on. There was also some really interesting data to show that students who did complete those individual activities were less likely to fail, and they were less likely to not submit their assessments. Students who did complete those individual activities had a failure rate of 8% versus the students who didn't complete those activities, who had a failure rate at 23%, so about 3 times higher. So there was some data to show that completing those activities really did help students with their learning. So the next question we asked was, what's your goal for these learning activities? What's the purpose of them? And Ben was able to very clearly articulate that in relation to the required readings, he wanted students to understand the value of the reading, to embed reading as a good habit for ongoing studies, and to improve the effectiveness of how they use that information. The goal for those individual practice activities, they were designed to provide an alternative to a lecture style session and to create opportunities for more active learning, as well as to prepare students for their assessments. So our initial conversations were very much around setting the scene. Who are your learners? How do they all vary? And what are the goals that they struggle with? Sorry, what are the activities they struggle with? And then really getting a clear sense, well, what is the purpose behind those activities? So we could open up some opportunities to maybe present them differently to better meet the diverse needs of those students. I'm just keeping an eye on time. I've got so much to share with you that I'm worried that I won't get there. So the next step in our relationship was really to build trust. And what I wanted to do, the next step was to take those struggles with students and start to think about, well, what is it in the way that the learning environment has been designed that is causing barriers for those learners? It's causing them to struggle with their learner. This can be confronting. So when you're working with colleagues, you really do want to have that kind of relationship where you're able to ask these questions without it being challenging or confronting. And the screenshot here is from a document that I created as we worked together to track our progress. The text is very small. There's no intention for you to actually be able to read it all, other than the headings. Our conversations restructured around, what do you think the potential barriers are? Then I would align that with the UDL framework. In particular, I would identify the principle that I felt that barrier could be addressed by, and then I would focus in on a particular checkpoint that would offer some suggestions about what we could do. And then in the third column here, I've got design solutions. And this was literally us brainstorming all the possibilities to remove the barrier that we had identified. You can see it's quite a lot. And to be honest, Ben said to me that it was enough for him at this initial phase to be able to think about the 3 principles of UDL: engagement, representation, action, and expression. And looking at the whole framework and the checkpoints was overwhelming. But for me, in order to tell my story, this was helpful for me to actually narrow in on those checkpoints. But that's something to think about. The framework itself can be quite overwhelming. So now I've got some examples that will actually show you what we did. So in order to address the barrier that students weren't understanding what they were expected to do, I asked the question, well, how will your students know what they need to learn? The solution was to think about ways to provide clear goals for every learning activity. And this included, on the right here, I've got screenshots from Ben's Canvas page. Every page of his Canvas site had a clear goal that we indicated with an icon of a target, and then the goal in bold. We had prompts at the bottom of the Canvas page, check your understanding, that linked back to the goal that was at the top of the page. Students didn't need to do anything with this other than read it and reflect. Have you actually got to that end point that we set for you at the start? And also including things, relevant statements. We have a heading here, what's next? And that was to make connections between the learning that had happened on a particular day with the activity that was going to be coming up next, for example, a tutorial. And as you can see here, I have identified that these solutions, design solutions, actually align with the UDL checkpoint 8.1, heightened salience of goals and objectives. The next example is in relation to the barrier that many students experience with the fact that they were being introduced to new vocabulary, and also the pace of the lecture, particularly if the students were studying in a language that wasn't their first language. So the question, how will you ensure all students can access this information and make sense of it? And the solution was to make materials available to all students in different formats. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we're making this variety of formats available to all students. This is one of the nice things about UDL. If you're trying to promote, it's a strategy that's efficient. We know that our academics are time poor, or if you're joining today from a school, teachers are time poor. And what we're talking about here is coming up with an intentional, proactive strategy that's going to benefit all students. So it's not about making some formats available for some groups of students, it's making everything available at the beginning. So what we looked at was presenting lecture materials in multiple formats. And the screenshot on the right here, you can see the lecture was recorded. So you had Ben talking to the slides, but the slides were also available as slides with notes, or the students could download just the transcript as well. And I've aligned this to UDL checkpoint 1.1, which is representation, offering ways of customizing the display of information. Got one more example to share with you here, and this is something that we have found that many other people across the university have been interested in and have taken on board in their own practice. So the barrier here was the complexity and the lengths of the text that students were needing to engage with. And the question we asked was, how can you support all of your students to engage with the task and complete it? So the solution was to offer guidance to support self-regulation. And this included highlighting key vocabulary, offering empathetic statements. So for example, here, on the Canvas site, it says some students will find it difficult to comprehend. So basically what we're doing here is acknowledging that these readings are going to be hard, but then offering some tips and tricks. So to prepare for your tutorial, there's giving some guidance about how long to spend. Spend an hour on the reading. And if you don't finish, don't worry. So for some students who may be overwhelmed by the length of a 16-page article, this is saying spend an hour, and while you're reading, focus on these key questions. So we're really facilitating personal coping skills and strategies. Now, this is quite small at the bottom of the screen here. I'll just read this to you. We also wanted to acknowledge that some students would still find this really difficult. And this is the strategy that has really people have been interested in. If you are finding this reading difficult, focus on this extract. So for every scholarly article, an extract was provided for students who found the language challenging, or for students who maybe just life load was getting in the way and they were time poor. But there was also another addition here. If you are finding the reading too easy, a more advanced reading was presented to students, varying the demands and resources to optimize challenge. This is an interesting one because providing an extract as an alternative to the full article is not about dumbing the learning down. It was a very intentional strategy to ensure that students engage with the readings. We already knew that 50% of students weren't engaging from the beginning. So the strategy was, let's present them with an achievable way of engaging with the article, with the goal that this would support them to, over the course of the semester, engage with the full article. So, of course, as I mentioned at the start, we wanted to gather data. And again, this is just a screenshot to share with you. And I've got a clearer slide to follow. But the reason I put this in here is just to indicate to you some of the questions we asked. So this was a 10-question survey. And it was informed by a survey developed by Katie Novak. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work, called the UDL Student Feedback Survey. I think these slides are going to be available to you, and the hyperlinks are in here as well. And we created questions to ask our students about the design features that supported their learning and fostered a sense of engagement. So I'll just read a couple of examples. Question 1, the unit materials and unit activities make me feel safe and accepted for who I am. Examples of unit materials are films, readings, lecture materials. Examples of unit activities are Zoom discussions, online discussion boards, quizzes and surveys. And then the students would respond using the Likert scale. Question 3, in this unit, I am provided with choices for how I will learn new knowledge and skills. Choices might include how I access learning material, how I record, respond to material, how I share my ideas, or adjusting which topics I discuss. So that's just to give you an idea. And this survey was given to students in the last 2 weeks of semester. We gave it to students at the end of 2021, and then again at the end of semester 1 in 2022. This is quite interesting to note as well, if you're thinking of doing something like this yourself. We did offer an incentive for students to complete the survey in the form of a gift card. Our survey responses were, in the first time around, we got 10% of students respond. The second time we ran the survey, we were much more upfront with students at the start, that we would be asking them to give feedback on the design, and that there was a lucky draw prize for students completing the survey. And we had 50% of students complete the second round of the survey. And once the pilot project was over, we did run the survey again. There was no incentive with that one, and we only had 8 students respond. So something to think about there in terms of how you incentivize surveys. But when I get to the parts where I'm talking about what we're doing in our new project, you'll see we've started to think about the timing of when we issue surveys. Okay, so here is our data, and you'll see here questions relating to feelings of acceptance and safety, recognition of choices in learning, understanding the importance of learning activities, perceptions of relevant, helpful feedback, finding learning support during difficult times, and being given the opportunity to reflect on learning. I'm looking at the column here, end of 2021. All of our responses were pretty high. But when we repeated this in the following semester, all of the response rates went up, and in particular in relation to understanding the importance of learning activities and finding learning support during difficult times. So there is some evidence here to suggest that the tasks that we were designing to support learning and to support students to persist and engage with learning had some impact. It's also worth noting that with 70% international students, this may have influenced the outcomes due to cultural context of high surveillance. So, for example, students not actually feeling allowed and not feeling that they could say what they really thought. So that may have skewed the results. But what's important to see is we did see an upward shift in the areas we were really targeting. But there were other things that came out of this project as well. And I'll draw your attention back to the phases of implementation, and where I see that the spin-offs from this project is where we were able to scale and optimize UDL implementation. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we developed a UDL Canvas site. So integrating the work that we were doing, that was where we left off before. But I also introduced a monthly UDL chat. 100% took the idea from the Twitter UDL chat that is run by CAST in the States, although internationally anyone can access that. So I run a monthly UDL chat. It's just 30 minutes on Zoom the first Wednesday of every month. And it's an opportunity for people to come together in this first phase. Really anybody interested in UDL to come along, find out more about it. And I also involved Ben Miller, who I had worked with on the pilot, to come and talk about what he had been doing and to give people an idea of what this actually looks like in context. As part of the work that Educational Innovation do, we offer design consultations. And so we added a UDL design consultation to our suite of offerings. Running workshops and presentations, so getting invited to talk with other educational designers at their meetings, symposia that we run at the university. So able to start to share the story of this pilot project. And we have an externally facing blog called Teaching at Sydney, and sharing articles via the blog, and also starting to interview the academics that we were working with. And that's a link to a YouTube site that you also will have access to. At this point, I also connected with this UDL community of practice run by ADCET, and that has been a great way to start to hear what other people are doing and also to share our story. And then looking for opportunities to share our story with a broader network. And we presented at the UDL in Higher Education Digicon that's hosted out of the States. And I have put a link to that in the notes of this slide. So that was our pilot project, and I've lost control of my cursor. Okay, I'm using my keyboard. Okay. So lessons learned. Okay, some things to share with you. We really avoided the acronym UDL. There are so many acronyms, and there's a risk that it doesn't mean anything. So very intentionally saying universal design for learning. Avoiding using the entire framework with its 31 checkpoints, and really focusing on multiple means of engagement, representation, action, and expression. Starting where you know you'll have most success. So working with an academic who was really keen to improve engagement for his students, had already been doing lots of work in that space before we met, meant that we were really able to gather momentum quickly. Cultivating a shift in thinking by developing a shared language. So looking for those opportunities to share at a team meeting something about UDL, even if it's throwing in the catchphrases of designing to the edges, ban the average, intentional proactive design, starting to get that into part of your everyday language. Start small. I think through this group already, you'll be familiar with the work of Thomas Tobin out of the States and the +1 strategy. That is a really helpful way to support getting started without feeling overwhelmed. This next point, I think, is a really important one to share, being transparent with your students about the intent behind the design. It's not about being perfect straight away. It's about trying something, seeing what the impact is, and then building on that. Often students aren't aware of the design or the thinking behind the design that you're using, and making them aware of it from the beginning so that they know to look for it and to use it can be really, really helpful, and especially when you're looking to gather feedback from your students as well. Know what you want change to look like, and then think about how you're going to gather data. So when you come up with a design solution that you're hoping is going to increase engagement with readings, how are you going to measure that? What is it you're hoping to see? Think about the timing of your surveys with students. So students get a lot of surveys. They tend to come towards the end of a unit. Think about maybe asking them earlier. And we've had some great success with our next iterations of this, whereas instead of waiting until the end of a semester, we're checking in with students around week 4 or week 5 and getting about a 50% response rate to the survey. The other benefit of that is it allows you to respond to their feedback. And that's another way to foster a sense for the students that my voice is being heard because my lecturer is responding to it while I'm still studying this particular unit. And most importantly, celebrate your UDL champions and share their stories. I think it's really important to share that we're not trying to provide a checklist of UDL strategies. We're trying to foster a culture of UDL thinking. And what one person might choose to do to remove a barrier in environment might be different from another person, but it can be equally effective. And I think sharing their stories is a really powerful way to get this message across. So here are our UDL champions, and I put links into short blog articles that they have written about their journey so far. So Benjamin Miller, who I worked with on the pilot study, Dr. Janelle Gifford in exercise and sports science. She's into her 4th year, or maybe we're 5th year now, of an assessment redesign, changing the weighting of an exam from a 60% high stakes exam into 2 case studies, so it's more relevant and authentic for her students. Jessica Pace and Andrew Bartlett in pharmacy have done a lot of work in the way they present information on a Canvas page to support students to find information and to come to their lab sessions prepared. They've had some great impact there. And Dr. Anne Quain in veterinary science, who has redesigned group work so that it is more meaningful and effective for her students. The other thing about the UDL champions is if you're trying to foster buy-in, get people to buy into this, we know that that teachers, lecturers are time poor. And hearing other people's positive stories and how not only their efforts have impacted student outcomes, but also impacted the academic as well is really powerful. And we've had some great USS, some student surveys from these academics as a result of the design changes that they have made. So there's a win-win in this. So where are we up to now? So the University of Sydney's 2032 strategy is now in place. And the strategy is focused on delivering student-focused education that is transformational and that ensures a greater diversity of students are successful at the university. Our response to supporting that happen, we have a teaching and learning strategy that identifies 6 initiatives in particular. One of the initiatives is around designing purposeful learning environments which are flexible and deliver the best outcomes to allow students to flourish anytime, anywhere. And in order to do that, what we're looking to do is embed best practices for online and blended teaching delivery, such as accessibility standards and universal design for learning. So again, as part of the strategy, UDL has been stated as the framework that we're going to use to improve equity and accessibility. And again, we needed to look at our data. Oh, sorry, actually, I'm just going to go back a second. And I didn't talk about the fact we're calling this the Designing for Diversity project. So we had our UDL pilot project. And the next step under the strategy is our Designing for Diversity project. And we intentionally changed the name because, as I mentioned before, there's a risk that UDL, the acronym, gets lost. UDL also is the framework that we're using, and we wanted the name of the project to really describe what we were doing and also use language that directly reflected the strategy. So designing for diversity is really describing what we are going to do. And it also draws attention to that priority of the university to increase diversity and success of students with diversity at the university. So the project is Designing for Diversity, and we're using the UDL framework as our tool to do that. We are very focused on looking at the improvement of outcomes for all learners, but in particular for these groups of students from equity backgrounds, where you can see here in this graph, the achievement gaps are significant between these groups and other students. So students from a low socioeconomic status background are First Nation students, students with disability, students from regional and remote areas, and students with culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. In particular, the gap here between our First Nation students and other students and students with disability. We also know that we have higher failure rates with students in the first year of their study and international students as well. So these particular groups are what we're really looking to measure, a decrease in the gap there in achievement. But in so doing, this is about all students as well. So because of the data here, the Designing for Diversity project is focusing on large first-year units of study. And when I say large, we're looking at enrolments that are 200 students or above. So that's the review of the data. We invited unit coordinators from these units to join the Designing for Diversity project. There was no obligation to join. This was come along, find out what we're offering, and work with us on this if you're interested. Review learner variability and barriers to learning in line with the UDL principles. So once we have the units on board, we're then able to work with the unit coordinator and start to look at their data around their students, following a similar process that we used with Ben, documenting those design decisions, and then we'll evaluate and plan our next steps. So at the bottom right here, you'll see our phases of UDL implementation, and we're back at the beginning again. We're starting to explore, prepare, and then we'll be thinking about how we can integrate this. We launched this project in May of this year, so just at the end of semester one. And this is hopefully a good time to meet with academics and start to plan for what's coming up in semester two. And this project is involving everyone in the educational innovation team. And I think that's another way that we can show that the work we're doing has started to scale. This isn't the responsibility of one person anymore. It's actually the way that we operate as a team. So based on our experience with the pilot project, I'm looking at time, okay. What we did is we simplified the process to make it more palatable and seem more achievable. We wanted to offer this Designing for Diversity mindset in 5 steps, and also this isn't linear either, but it's you'll see how it connects with the work that I did with Ben. We want to start by thinking about learners. Who are my learners? We want to move on to thinking about what is it you're hoping your learners will achieve? What is the goal? And that can be for the entire unit. It can be for a lecture. It can be for an assessment task. And then start to think about, well, what are the barriers to learning for those students we've talked about? Moving on to step 4, let's come up with some solutions, brainstorm as many solutions as possible, but pick the one solution that you know you have the time to work on in the time you have available. So the educational innovation team work alongside the academics, but the academics are in control of the project. They choose how much they can take on. And then, so we are really at this phase now where we're working with academics on coming up with what it is they want to change or add to their unit design. And then mid-semester, we'll be starting to think about some initial collection of data. And you can read more about this in a blog. I put the link up there. Just going to try and speed up. We started with student voice, and we got students to come to our workshop to talk to us about experiences where their learning was really impacted by barriers in the design of the delivery of the unit, but also to talk about examples of when the unit was designed in a way that really supported their learning. I'm going to skip through this slide just in the interest of time. So at the moment, we're working with 12 unit coordinators across 6 faculties. So before, remember, we had 1 unit coordinator from the Faculty of Art and Social Sciences. Now we have 6 faculties. We've got architecture, business, engineering, law, medicine and health, and science. And the project team can include co-coordinators, educational designers from the school or faculty, tutors and students. So it depends what the unit coordinator, how the unit coordinator wants to run it. And here are just a few examples of the barriers that have been identified so far as in the project, and some solutions. So for example, one of the barriers is an assumption around the knowledge that students are bringing to the start of their, into a new unit. And the solutions that will be tested out is acknowledging the range of skills with your students, offering support materials to help students who don't have as much of the prior knowledge, and using language that is encouraging. Another example here, a barrier, is the physical space that's creating a barrier for students to communicate with each other. Solutions that are going to be tested are icebreaker activities, getting to know each other, and physically adjusting the space so that they can connect. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So what you'll see here is that moving on to as we move through the phases of implementation, we've got those targeted 12 unit coordinators that we're working with. We have now just created online workshops that are available to anyone across the university who wants to join us. They'll be starting tomorrow. We are continually looking to capture more stories from our UDL champions and adding those to our UDL Canvas site. And the UDL chat, we're looking to grow into more of a community of practice where there is an opportunity to connect with each other in between our monthly chats. We also, I've got a transition slide here. So we're also continuing with the other ways of working that you saw in the previous slide. And finally, measuring impact. As I mentioned before, this is such an important part of the UDL implementation process. I've just given you an extract here of how we're looking to measure our impact. Our goal essentially is going to be reduce the achievement gap for equity groups. The outcomes of this project will be, we want to see changes in the design of units of study that incorporates the language of universal design for learning. And we'd like to see increasing uptake of UDL across whole faculties and schools. And how will we measure that? Well, we'll look at student data, student achievement data. We'll be looking at before and after stories that our academics can share with us. Looking at an increase in statements of learning design that are the way academics are sharing their intentional design with their students, increasing our stories, our change stories, and looking at UDL language and concepts starting to appear in faculty processes, procedures, and guidelines. And the last reference here, this whole process for the Designing for Diversity project, simplifying UDL into 5 steps, is very much informed by the UDL reporting criteria, which is a great document to refer to in terms of structuring your thinking, particularly if you want to publish your work on UDL implementation. It offers a criteria that identifies key factors that you need to be able to incorporate into a publication around UDL implementation. So just before I get cut off, I can see Darlene coming back on. Top tips for you for getting started is start where you know you're going to have most success. Think about making just one change. Make it your own. So you can see that the way we're trying the 5 steps for designing for diversity is we're seeing if that is going to support more academics buy into UDL. Walk alongside your colleagues and share, connect with these communities, listen to other people's stories and share your stories. The UDL community internationally is incredibly generous, and the more we connect and share and learn from each other, the greater the impact will be. And I'll stop there.
Sorry, it's just absolutely brilliant, and I didn't want to stop you, but we have pretty much run out of time, and we've had some fabulous questions. I didn't actually ask prior if you're happy to answer them, but we will talk to you if we can either record your answers or if you could respond. I got people to vote for their favourite questions, so I might just get one in here. Is how did you get the data of students not engaging with required readings and completing practice activities? Was it through the LMS or did you ask teachers and learners?
Yeah, through the LMS. So the library system, we have Leganto, and I was able to go in and actually see the number of clicks, essentially.
Yeah, excellent. There's some really great questions, and maybe we might even fit another one or two in. One of the ones which Amy asked, if you knew what you know now, what would you advise other institutions about to embark on this process?
Oh gosh, that's really, I think just get started and connect with other people. You know, really use this community of practice to test out your ideas. That there's no right or wrong way to do this. The most important thing is that we start to shift our practice one small step at a time. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And do you, the one that had 4 questions and upvotes, do you provide multiple formats of material simultaneously or add them afterwards?
Oh, for the lecture recordings.
Yeah, I think that was related to that.
So I think that depends on the mode of delivery. So for Ben's example, when we were working together, he was still running the lectures fully online. He would, the lecture would be, he would have the slides available to students while presenting, and then the recording and the transcripts would be added afterwards.
Excellent. All right. And just trying to look for the other, with, it's probably a big question, with your DAP in 2019 to 2024 and your strategic plan, which is from 2022 to 2032, have you had any issues with competing priorities? Big question.
It is a big question.
Sorry, I probably shouldn't have asked that one.
No, I'm going to say no, because I mean the university itself is a busy place, and you know, there's always lots going on. But I think that the very fact that the projects were identified through those plans means that they're a priority. So that absolutely has helped us keep momentum. That's
brilliant. Now, is there another slide that you had?
Yeah. Just my final.
Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us. Well, there's a few more questions that hasn't been answered, so we'll get Sarah to answer those. I've also added into the link that the information around UDL, which is on ADCET. There is an e-learning course that you can undertake if you haven't undertaken that. Once you undertake that course, you can apply for the community of practice that Sarah's spoken about. Although we support that community practice, it is actually managed by TAFE SA, which is fabulous. We also have a couple of webinars coming up in September, which Jane will now put into the chat. And yeah, so thank you, Sarah. Absolutely fabulous to have you. It was great hearing, following along on Twitter and in the chat. I could see so many people are engaged and very well presented. Using the UDL framework for the whole thing was absolutely brilliant as well. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us, and have a great day. And thank you everybody for joining us. Fabulous to have you all here.